I hope you've enjoyed following along with the examples so far, because this is where it really starts to get interesting for designers. Back in Chapter 1, we talked about early layout method techniques, which involve positioning. With this chapter, we're going to concentrate on floats, and begin by looking at how we can use floats to create column layouts. So let's dive into some code.
While you're doing that, Andy, I just want to point out that it's interesting that floats in CSS are very akin to the way we used to align images to the right or the left. For example, we would use presentational markup, image align equals right, and that would move the image to the right, and then we might give it an H space and a V space value for some horizontal and vertical space, and this would allow the text to flow around that image. Floating in CSS actually emerged from that particular desire to be able to float images to the right or to the left and have the text flow around them. So it's interesting to point out that floats were really never meant for creating column-based layouts, as you're going to show. However, they serve the purpose very well.
There are one or two problems with floated layouts, and we're going to take a look at some of those problems and how to solve them. I'm over in Dreamweaver in CodeView, and I've created a simple XHTML document which has got 3 divs, one for content, and nested inside that we have a div for the main content and a div for the sub-content, each one wrapped inside the content div. So if we have a look at that with the browser default style, so let's save the page and preview this in the browser, hopping over into Firefox, and we can see the 2 paragraphs of text, but there's no layout evident at this point. So we need to start adding some style. So I'm going to hop back over into my code editor, and here I'm going to drag over 1 or 2 snippets of code. So I'm going to start by styling the body tag. I'm adding some font and some font color rules, but also most importantly, I'm using text align center on the body tag. I'm going to explain why that's there a little bit later on. So let's save that and catch up with the progress over in Firefox. And back straight into the editor, where we can start adding some styles for the columns that we want to create. First of all, I'm going to add some styling for the content div, which wraps around the other 2 columns. And here I've given it a width, zeroed out the margins and paddings, and reset the text alignment to left to override the center that we placed on the body tag. What's interesting to note here is on the margin, we're using margin 0 auto. Now this relates to the equivalent of margin top auto. So the browser is automatically going to calculate how much margin to leave on the left and the right side, centering the layout. So let's have a look at that. Preview this in the browser. And now we can see we've got the container styled with the right width. Still not looking very exciting though, so let's nip back into the editor and add a couple of more styles. The first style I'm going to add is for the main content, and here I've just added a background colour and zeroed out the margins and padding. And the same thing, although with a slightly different background colour, for the sub-content. So if we see what that's looking like now over in Firefox, let's do a refresh, and we can see that the background colour has been applied to both of those divs. But let's start creating some columns, and this is where the float property comes into action. First thing I'm going to do is to apply the float property onto the content main. So we're going to say float right, because I'm looking for a layout which has got a left-hand sidebar. And I'm also going to give this div a width in pixels. One thing to point out here is that I'm using a fixed pixel width design, where the overall design is fixed within the browser window, rather than a fluid or elastic layout which will expand according to the text size in the browser window. So I'm going to set this at 540 pixels, and I'm going to do a similar thing on the content div, onto content sub, and this time I'm going to float this div left and give it a width of 240 pixels. So the width of the 2 divs adds up to the same as the content. So let's save this. Flip over into Firefox and refresh. And now we have 2 columns. This layout is going to be the basis for the completed page design that we're working to throughout this title. So let's move on and look at other ways in which we can use floats.